Welcome back, hockey fans. This is episode 113 of Clappercast Hockey Podcast. My name is Sean. I'll be hosting this week's episode. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to make sure you check out our website, clappercast.com, to find all of our content, our blog posts included. Recently, we put up posts on Jacob Chychrun trade rumors, as well as mid-season Vezina candidates that I'll actually talk about later in this episode, for example. Also, make sure you follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram at Clappercast Media, and on Twitter at Clappercast. And there you'll find more content updates, the occasional meme, and some hockey news and updates throughout the week. So around the NHL this week, we're still sort of seeing the effects of the league's COVID outbreaks, with a ton of games being postponed still, and some teams being short 5+ players on any given night. But one of the teams that's seeing the effects of this, along with other injury-related circumstances, is Montreal. They have the highest cap hit in the league. They're sitting around $94.3 million in total cap hit. But as of this episode, they're icing a roster that costs just over $40 million with the rest of it on IR. And this is actually an improvement over the last couple of weeks, as there was a point where they had maybe 20 to 25 million of that cap hit on the ice. Everyone else was injured on COVID protocol, etc. So their current starting lineup is short upwards of 15 players on some nights from like a projected opening night roster. So they weren't doing all that great at the beginning of the season either, when they were down just like Weber and Price. But it's no surprise at this point to see them sitting just a single point above the Coyotes for last in the NHL. And that single point is an overtime loss because they played one more game than Arizona. It's just a really unfortunate situation for the team, for the franchise, of everything happening at once. And you look at their roster some nights and you're trying to figure out who the players are. There's prospects you've never heard of because they're unfortunately that far down in the depth chart that they're now being thrusted into positions in NHL games. It does end up being an interesting opportunity, though, for those players as they get a chance to play in NHL games that they might not have otherwise ever been able to. And who knows, maybe a little bit of time up in the big leagues is just a boost to their development and helps them, kind of push the ceiling of where they could end up a little bit more. Moving on to one of the biggest and most shocking stories of the past week is the latest in the saga of Evander Kane. A couple of days ago, Elliot Friedman reported that he was waived for the purposes of contract termination. This came kind of out of nowhere, as we hadn't heard anything about him for a couple of weeks. He had actually been out of the roster in the AHL for a couple of weeks at this point, dealing with a supposedly bad case of COVID. So eventually, obviously, he cleared the waivers. No one's going to take a chance on claiming that contract. And the contract has been terminated. Of course, the NHLPA is filing a grievance. From the sounds of what the termination is for, there isn't much of a case to be made, as it's reported that it's for a breach of his standard players contract, importantly, a breach of AHL COVID protocols. Reportedly, he traveled to Vancouver while COVID positive. This is after, of course, Evander Kane being someone who was suspended at the beginning of the season for forging a COVID vaccination card. I kind of have to imagine at this point the whole condition on San Jose letting him back into the organization, despite apparently the players and the rest of the organization didn't really want him back. The whole thing was San Jose just kind of letting him do his thing, but just watching him with a magnifying glass, and they're just waiting for something like this to happen so that they could find the grounds to terminate the contracts. And this really seems like it is enough that Bill Daly, the deputy commissioner of the NHL, says they're confident there is sufficient cause for this. And after how many times this guy has been blatantly breaking these types of rules, and who knows what goes on behind the scenes as well, because this is just what gets reported, the stuff that's becoming mainstream. And at this point, too, we know his personal life has its own fair share of issues and despicable behavior. So you really, really hope that at some point someone can get through to him finally and get him the help he needs, because there's clearly something going on, and you don't want to see someone continually sabotaging their own life and impacting the people around them in the way that he is. At this point, I really hope that no NHL team signs him so that he can finally maybe face some of the consequences of what's going on and get himself straightened out before he even attempts to try and find a new home in professional hockey. But knowing the state of NHL teams and how they approach these types of situations, they don't really care what he is or what he does or how bad of a person he is, as long as he can play hockey. And unfortunately, it's already been reported today that by Darren Dreger that Ken Holland has been in contact with Kane's agent, which is, as an Oilers fan, not great. I do not want to see that situation happen, and it is not the right time to bring in, that type of a reclamation case into this organization. So I really hope that's just, a GM doing his due diligence and knocking on doors or whatever they do to find potential fits for the team. I really hope that's not a contract that happens, and I don't want to see that right now. That would be something to maybe consider in a couple of years when Kane has had significant time to sort out his own personal life and personal issues and get the actual help he needs before he can make a comeback to professional hockey and not completely sabotage himself and the organizations he belongs to. Moving on to a different NHL defender who might be looking for a new organization to play for right away is John Klingberg of the Dallas Stars. Klingberg is currently in the final year of his contract, but negotiations between Klingberg and the Stars have stalled out. Originally, he wanted to sign before the season, like some others. I'm looking specifically at like a Miro Heiskanen, who signed an extension over the past offseason. But in terms of Klingberg's contract, it's been very quiet on his end. He ultimately feels underappreciated with the way things have been going. And, he is a dedicated Dallas Star. He's been there since day one, like he says, and the seeming disinterest in keeping him around is leaving a sour taste in his mouth. Klingberg himself would dispute the actual trade request. Like, he doesn't, in his words, I don't think it's entirely true. It's not like I've been going out there and asking, I want to be traded now, or something like that. It's something that's been going on with negotiations and stuff. So he's not going to come out right and say he doesn't want to stay there, because that's obviously not going to help negotiations either. But in this same, report, him and his agents have gotten permission to talk to other GMs and see where they were at. So it's kind of like a light trade request, and more of like, if you're not going to sign me, then at least let me go and, pursue other organizations and see what's going on elsewhere. In terms of Klingberg and his personal ask, he wants term. He wants something in the 8-year, $60 million range. In my opinion, that's way too much for him, but we have also seen how defender contracts just went this past offseason, so that type of a deal is not entirely out of the realm of possibility. In terms of the organization side of things, Elliot Friedman suggests that Jim Nill, the Dallas Stars GM, is hesitant to give out a long-term contract to someone heading into his 30s. Klingberg's currently 29. Specifically after how Tyler Sagan and Jamie Benn have turned out, because those two contracts are absolute boat anchors for the Stars for a long time yet. And to have another one of those contracts is going to, potentially on the books, is just really going to hamper the organization for the next decade by the time they can get out of them. In order to kind of meet the demands of both sides, per se, we might end up seeing Klingberg getting a bit more per year at the expense of some term. So maybe Nill would be more comfortable giving out like a 5-year contract, a 5 or 6 year contract instead, to take Klingberg into his mid-30s. In place of that, we might end up seeing a bit of a higher per year AAV, something in the high 8 millions, to compare it to the rest of the contracts that have been given out for defenders of Klingberg's capability of that 40 to 50 points that he's been able to put up in the past. But even then, that is still a lot for a defender who has gone significantly downhill these past 2 seasons, which is Klingberg's case. He still has 17 points in 27 games this year, which isn't bad in terms of straight production, but his play on the ice just hasn't been nearly as impactful as it had been in years past, where he was one of the best defenders in the league. He was incredibly underrated. And one of the biggest reasons I think a trade is probably going to end up happening, or would be the best case scenario here for Klingberg, is that there is an argument to be made that Dallas coach Rick Bowness's system is responsible for Klingberg's downfall the past couple of seasons, as it's, a fairly straightforward look that the season that Bowness comes in, Klingberg starts to decline. Now, defenders hitting their prime years in their late 20s, it's kind of weird for him to start a downfall that significant that quick. But when the organization's focus shifts from Klingberg to Heiskanen over the past couple seasons, as well as Klingberg's style of play, his breakout, his passing, just doesn't quite fit what Bowness runs as his breakout and offensive strategies. Dallas also doesn't quite have much cap space to work with here, because Klingberg is going to be looking at probably a $4 million raise over his current cap hit. And as of right now, they have like $24 $4 million to sign 8 players, including Klingberg's potential $8+ million. I would really expect talk around this situation to heat up over the next month as we start to hit the trade deadline, whether that be news of a contract extension for Klingberg or just straight up trading him. But I would really think that the Dallas Stars should be pushing hard to keep Klingberg because they do not have the strongest right defensive depth, and to lose someone like Klingberg is really going to put a bit of a tricky situation trying to fill that spot in the offseason. They have Heiskanen, who can play, according to Cap Friendly, will play either side on defense, but beyond that, there isn't much. And when there isn't much there in the organization already, they're ultimately going to have to go and overpay in free agency for someone who isn't quite as good, or they're not going to afford someone who's more expensive than that, but they won't get quite the bang for the buck that they could get with John Klingberg. Now, for Klingberg himself, if there is a mismatch between his style of play and the coach's system, a trade might be the best situation because then he can go and thrive in a different organization that's better suited to his talents. And for that reason, this type of a trade could be very, very high risk, but it's also a really high reward rental. And probably a return in the range of a prospect and a pick, like a late first or a second, with a conditional pick on Klingberg re-signing there, could be something that would end up heading back to Dallas. Now, with Dallas being a semi-competitive team themselves right now, they might prefer an NHL-ready asset over the prospect to replace Klingberg in that. And of course, when you have trade discussions starting, you have to start looking to the teams around the league that might make a play for him. So, in my view, one of the teams that should and hopefully will make a play for Klingberg is to be a great situation is the Nashville Predators. They're unexpectedly in the top spot in the Central Division. They're a lot more competitive than teams we thought they would be. So it might be a solid year because they have a ton of cap space to play with to go all in at the deadline and see if they can make one more cup run here while they have players like UC Saros and Roman Josi playing at the top of their game. Right defense is a position the Predators are not particularly strong in, and for Klingberg to come in, he'd immediately be slotted in on the top pairing alongside Roman Josi. And we know that the style of play that Nashville uses can support a defender with offensive talents utilizing those talents because Roman Josi is regularly leading the team in scoring and is quite often the team's best player. Nashville has all of their draft picks heading into the next few seasons, and they also have a fairly solid collection of prospects that they could part with that would be relatively NHL ready, could slot into Dallas's lineup pretty quickly, but also are still good enough that they can improve and help Dallas out in a couple of seasons, as well as giving them cheaper options to help fill the lineup while they try and figure out their cap situation. Because like I mentioned before, they have a couple of boat anchor contracts there that they are not going to be able to move. So John Klingberg to Nashville would be like a best case scenario for me, as I think that would be a great fit for every party involved. Don't know if it would happen. I don't know what Nashville's ultimate plans are on being a buyer at the deadline, but we'll wait and see where that heads. Another potential option for John Klingberg, and this is going to start mimicking the Jacob Chychrun blog post and previous episode we were talking about destinations for him. But another option is possibly Boston. We talked about them wanting a bit more on defense, and John Klingberg could give them a little bit more of an offensive touch that they are sorely lacking on their defense right now. John Klingberg, being a right-handed defender, would slot in on the second pair behind Charlie McAvoy, but that's also probably a decent thing as it kind of gets him out of the spotlight a bit, though he might end up in a situation like he is right now behind Miro Heiskanen. But I think a lot of the uncertainty around whether or not that would happen, it just comes down to the coach's system, and will Klingberg mesh better with what the Boston Bruins are doing versus what he's got going on in Dallas. And the situation in Boston is quite a bit better, and he's going to be looked at more for his offensive talents. Like I said, Boston doesn't have a great offensive cast on their blue line, so Klingberg is going to give them something that they don't currently have a lot of, which might help him fit into a better situation where he's given a little bit more offensive freedom to create the play how he wants to. Another potential landing spot for John Klingberg is the Florida Panthers. I don't quite think that Klingberg would be as good a fit for Florida as Jacob Chychrun would be, and it comes down to handedness with John Klingberg being a right-handed defender and Jacob Chychrun being a left side. But Florida's a bit stronger on the right side, where they're icing Aaron Ekblad, Radko Gudas, and Brandon Montour. Now, I don't think Florida would have much of an issue pushing Gudas down to the third pairing if they get a guy like John Klingberg in. But this would just give an already stacked blue line in Florida another offensive weapon, where to a point where they're going to have four defenders who can put up 40 to 50 points on a season, which is insane. So that would just give them another major push towards going all in this season to try and make a deep cup run. And then a couple other potential teams that might kick some tires on John Klingberg are like a Pittsburgh. They always seem to be in on players at the deadline. They seem to always try and acquire somebody. Or maybe a Toronto, because again, they're a team that's often in on defense, on acquiring defenders. And they're also having a really strong season and might want to make a bit of a push themselves. But there's going to be quite a strong market for these types of defenders heading into the trade deadline, as we have Jacob Chychrun, John Klingberg, Ben Sherratt, and Mark Giordano all rumored to be on the trade blocks. There's going to be quite some competition here, and a lot of these teams that we're talking about for Chychrun and Klingberg, they're going to end up getting somebody. Might not be their first choice, but they're going to end up being in on somebody and probably getting them. Into our last topic for today. We're starting to hit the midpoint of the season. I know there's some teams that are at 38 games and some teams haven't even played their 30th yet. But one of the big trends, and this is something that's kind of amazing me, is the amount of high quality and high caliber goalies who could reasonably receive some Vezina consideration. I don't know if I quite remember a season where there's, as many as 8 players who are, Vezina caliber seasons at this point. So I wrote a blog post earlier in this week detailing the main candidates, but it is worth another mention just to put them on another platform here. So first up in Vezina caliber goalies this season, we've got Jack Campbell. Now playing with the Toronto Maple Leafs, Campbell has taken over that team's net through last season when Freddie Anderson was out and injured and inconsistent. And this season he was supposed to kind of be a 1A, 1B with Peter Mrazek. But again, Peter Mrazek's been out for most of the season, which has given Campbell the entire opportunity to take that starter's crease, and he has done that. He has been probably the best goalie in the league at this point. His individual numbers, like he's leading the league in goals saved above average by a little margin at 20.7. His 17-5-3 record, he's got a sub 2.0 GPA and a 936 save percentage to tie him for first in the league. That's a stat line that is well deserving of a Vezina Trophy, and it's quite incredible for him, the meteoric rise over the past few seasons since he got traded to Toronto and has taken over the starter's crease. Jack Campbell is, in my opinion, the early season favorite for the Vezina Trophy. Then we move on to the New York Rangers with Igor Shesterkin. He has taken this crease by storm, quickly becoming the Rangers' full-time starter. It's his second full season in the NHL, and he's already making an amazing name for himself. Shesterkin has been a huge reason why the Rangers are sitting up at the top of the Metro Division, and they're like 5th in the NHL in points percentage. It's quite the turnaround from last season, and you get in a coach like Gerard Gallant to come in as well, and that's going to make a huge difference. But you cannot overlook the impact of having this level of a goaltender on your team. Shesterkin sits tied with Campbell for the league lead in save percentage as of recording at 936, 4th in the league with a 2.09 goals against average. And he's 3rd in the league and goals saved above average at 17.1. So he hasn't played quite as many games as some of the other starters and Vezina contenders, but that's a big enough sample size to place him very high up in the rankings for the league's top goalie. Now, Andrei Vasilevskiy, next up on the list here. He may not be as statistically dominant as the others this season, but after 4 consecutive seasons being a Vezina finalist and winning it one year, Vasilevskiy is a shoo-in to receive a ton of votes for this award. And he has an argument to be made for him still. The NHL GMs who vote on this award tend to really look at a goalie's record and the win total. Andrei's tied for the league lead and wins at 19. And his stat line is not unimpressive either, with a 923 save percentage, 223 goals against average, as well as an 11.17 goals saved above average. So he's still top 10 in all of those stats as well. Now, back when I was talking about John Klingberg potentially going to Nashville because they're unexpectedly at the top of the Central Division right now, UC Saros is one of the main reasons why Nashville has been able to sustain or turn around that downward trajectory they had after their President's Trophy and Cup final those couple seasons a few years back. And it looked like heading into last year's midpoint of the season that Nashville was going to be a seller. They were going to start rebuilding. But then UC Saros turned his season around, led the Predators to a late season push, getting them into the playoffs, and he's continued that this season. UC Saros is, at this point, probably the most underrated goalie in the league, as he's not getting much consideration last season for the Vezina for what he did to get the Predators into the playoffs. And you still don't see him getting the proper amount of recognition for what he's doing this season as well. Saros currently sits tied for the league lead in wins with 19. He's second in goals saved above average at 17.58. He is fourth with a 929 save percentage and sixth with a 221 goals against average. Next up, we're going to be looking at a goalie who's had just an incredible bounce back season in Tristan Jarry. 2020-2021 was not a good season for him. 909 save percentage, 275 goals against average, and he was unfortunately most remembered for a massive gaffe in the playoffs that cost the Penguins an important game, put them down in the series against the Islanders 3-2. But after an offseason wondering if Pittsburgh would give Jarry another chance or if they'd trade him and go with Casey DeSmith, Tristan Jarry was given the starter's crease again, given that second chance, and he has done nothing but impress. So he now sits fourth in the league at the 16.49 goals saved above average, indicating that he has been a huge part of keeping the Penguins competitive when they've been missing so many of their key players for a lot of the season, with Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Jake Gensel, and Brian Rust all missing for significant stretches of games. Jarry's sitting on a 17-6-4 record, sitting at third in the league with a 931 save percentage, and actually leading the league with a 1.94 goals against average. That stat line is insane, that he's still got a sub 2.0 goals against average. And even though it's tough competition for this Vezina Trophy race, he should still get some recognition for what he's been and how good he's been for the Penguins so far. Next up, we've got the season's shutout king in Jacob Markstrom. So his first season in Calgary was a little bit disappointing, but the team also struggled big time, so it can't be placed entirely on him. Markstrom came out flying for the second season, and early on he was by far the favorite. He started the year with 5 shutouts in his first 13 games, which is just an insane record. It's an insane game log to look back on. He's trailed off a little bit since then, but he's still got the league lead in shutouts. He's sitting 6th in save percentage at 926, and he's got a goal saved above average of 11.7. So early on, his play was one of the biggest reasons that the Flames currently do sit third in the Pacific Division, and he might not be a favorite for the award, but he should definitely get some consideration and be on a few ballots just for how much of a standout he's been in that position. Now for one of the dark horses, one of the underdogs in this Vezina Trophy race, in Thatcher Demko for the Vancouver Canucks. It's been widely documented, including on our podcast, how bad of a state the Canucks were in early on this season until the house cleaning happened, getting rid of the coach and the GM. And despite the team's poor play, Thatcher Demko has stood out as just an elite caliber goalie who gave the Canucks a chance game in, game out. Even when the team's at its worst, Demko was still only letting in 2 or 3 goals most of those games, and unfortunately they were not able to win to reward Demko for his play, but he's still keeping them in it as best he can. Although his stats don't really stand out as a Vezina winning goalie because of the team he's on, that 15-11-1 record with a 920 save percentage and 2.55 goals against average, those do not reflect the quality of Demko's play and Demko's impact on the game and the team. We've seen a significant turnaround in the team's play and even, an improvement in Demko's play from what he was doing before since Bruce Boudreau took over. In the first 7 games that he's played, Demko gave up 10 goals in those 7 games and had a 955 save percentage. That's not sustainable over a full season, but it's just an indication that Demko was amazing before, and now he's just an absolutely out-of-this-world goalie. Now, if the Canucks keep up the level of play that they've had in December under the new coach through the rest of the season, we might see Demko become a strong contender for the Vezina Trophy because his stat line's definitely going to improve. But if they kind of regress a little bit after on, Demko might not get a whole lot of votes just because the stat line's not going to be there, despite that he might actually have been the best goalie in the league over the season. And the last goalie that I wanted to throw into this consideration here is going to be a case study in the team making the goalie or is the goalie making the team? And that's going to be on Frederick Anderson. So he's come to Carolina this season after fizzling out of Toronto. And so far, this has been Freddie Anderson's best season of his career, which is where you kind of get the idea from before. Is it the goalie making the team or the team making the goalie? Anderson's now found himself in a great situation with a strong Hurricanes team that is performing better than we thought they would after all of the lineup changes they made in the offseason. But it's also not surprising that the team is good considering the depth and the style of play they have. Through his first 23 games in Carolina, Anderson's got an 18-5-0 record. He's 5th with a 929 save percentage and an 11.94 goals saved above average, and he's second. He's one of the other 3 goalies with a sub 2.0 goals against average. He's at 1.96 as of now. So Anderson might be a bit of a dark horse for the award this season, and he could very well end up leading or being close to leading in all major goalie stat categories. but I don't know if he's going to get quite the consideration just because of the amount of media attention given to Freddie Anderson and given to the Carolina Hurricanes. But that doesn't mean that Anderson has not been an important part who should be getting some discussion for this award. Now, if I had to pick my Vezina Trophy ballot right now, like I mentioned before, my first place vote would go to Jack Campbell. My second place vote needs to go to UC Saros because he needs recognition for how good he's been and how much he's done for that Predators organization. And Tristan Jarry for what he's done to keep the Penguins competitive this season and just how much of a turnaround and how strong he's been would get my third place vote. That wraps things up for this time here on Clappercast. Make sure you rate and review this episode and toss a follow or subscribe our way. For more content, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Clappercast Media or on Twitter at Clappercast. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with more hockey talk.